Welcome to Authentically Debz, a podcast about a Southern girl looking at 70. Hi, I'm Deborah Jan Gray. Where do I begin? I'm 68. I believe I have had several lifetimes on this planet. Since I believe in reincarnation, I may have had hundreds, even thousands. I want this to be my last incarnation here on Earth. I aspire to a higher level. Beam me up, Scotty. But there is intelligent life here. And I have more lessons. I was born in 1950 into the bowels of the South, Shreveport, Louisiana. I was born to older parents. I was an only child. My parents divorced before I was 2, and nobody got divorced back then. I was raised by my mother and my maternal grandmother in a little bitty town called Haynesville. I think it was named for some general in the Confederacy, but we called it Haynesville. And aside, they really do still grow football players down there. I lived there happily and ignorantly in the Jim Crow South with mostly the racists that surrounded me. I'm going to give my parents a slight grace on that, because they were more well-traveled. And I think Mark Twain said, travel is the death of bigotry, something like that. My dad was, or became, career Air Force. He flew fighter jets in the North Korean conflict in World War II, and then the same in the Korean theater of war. And then after that, I think he just flew generals around all over the world and retired as a colonel. My mother was a party girl. She attended at least 10 different universities before marrying, having me, divorcing, and realizing that she would have to get her degree from Southern State in Magnolia, Arkansas. As a little girl, I remember my relatives referring to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as a criminal. They blamed him for bringing all the goddamn Yankees and northern niggers down south. It was his fault, because we never had any problem with our niggers until then. It was sort of like being raised by Al-Qaeda or ISIS or Trump supporters. But that's the kind of language that I grew up hearing. Aside from my parents, to a lesser degree, my relatives were flat out racist, full out racists. But they loved me. a little white girl. We never locked our doors at night. We never locked our cars. We left the keys in the ignition. I mean, after all, who would want to hurt us? I mean, who could? I found out later that my maternal grandfather, my deceased maternal grandfather, had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan. No surprise there. And I had two uncles. One had a gas station, and I remembered that there were 3 restroom doors. One said men, one said ladies, and one said colored. My other uncle had a drive-in Dairy Queen, and the outside front service window said, "For whites only." And the little side window said, "Colored." I just thought that's the way it was, if I even gave it any thought at all. When I was no older than 8, I remember we used to always have Sunday dinner at my grandmother's house. Of course, we called lunch dinner, and the evening meal was called supper. Every Sunday, me and my mother, my grandmother, aunts, uncles, their kids, everybody would come to my grandmother's, and we'd have Sunday dinner that our wonderful cook and a very good friend of mine, Nobi, who had worked for them for over 30 years, long before I was born, slaved over and cooked. Well, after dinner, which Nobi cooked, and after she'd cleaned up everything, someone from my family would volunteer to take her home. And I always made it a point of going. I sat in the back seat, so whether it was my mother or my uncle, whoever it was, we drove to the quarters, for lack of a better word. That's where Nobi lived. It was a neighborhood of all black families, mostly rundown houses, but not all. Nobi had the most rundown shack of any of the houses in the quarter. And looking back, I wonder why no one in my family ever bothered to do something to try to make her home livable. Anyway, after we left, or after we dropped Nobi off, we would usually go by, we would basically always go by this one house, and it was a really nice house. And there was this little black boy that was usually playing in the yard, about my age. And when we would see each other, I would begin, at my tender age, to flirt with him mercilessly. I would make provocative facial gestures. I would do my eyelashes so that he would notice me. I would smile at him in a very sexy way, of what I understood it to be at that point. I even waved at him. when he looked at me, and he never looked away, but all he could do was stare with his eyes as big as saucers. Because I'm quite sure his parents told him, don't ever speak to a white child, or for that matter, don't ever speak to white people in general, unless you're spoken to. I really had no idea the imminent danger I was putting that child in. God forgive me, for I know not what I did, and I never got caught. But if I had got caught, I would have probably said, he started it, he did it. And the consequences of that, I have no idea what they would have been. When I was 10, I had my first bout, my first manifestation of OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, a disability which has plagued me my entire life. That was just the first outing, real outing of it. Of course, back then, and I don't think this was just a Southern thing, but when you had what I was giving out, what I was showing, people called it having a nervous breakdown. But it was OCD. And obsessive compulsive disorder is one of the 3 major mental illnesses in the world, along with bipolar and schizophrenia. But it gets a lot less press than the other 2. I know that I'm surely you remember cases of it. For example, Howard Hughes. He definitely had it. And there can be a good part of OCD. Because with OCD, you obsess about something to the point that it drives you crazy, or you're in so much mental pain that you have to compulse, you have to do something. And I think he probably obsessed about building this biggest plane in the world that would actually fly. And so to get away or to get out of that obsession, he had to do something, and he built that plane. And it did fly once. But then we also know how he died, and that was also OCD. I think it started with his obsession of cleanliness. So you can go from one obsession to another with OCD. And that obsession of cleanliness eventually had him withdrawn from society, starvation, and ultimately he died of it. I'll mention one other thing, and I have no validity, no verification of this. But I guess about 10 years ago, you may remember it, a woman in Texas killed her 5 children. I remember it was on the news, and when you saw her, she had long hair, but she had blotches of baldness. And I knew immediately that among any other type of psychosis the woman had, she had OCD, because a subcategory of it is trichotillomania, and that's when you pull huge amounts of your hair out. And then I got to thinking that she was probably obsessing about, and I remember reading about, she was obsessing about something to do with the devil, that the devil was in her, or she was the devil, or the devil was making her do this because her children were devils. And so to get out of that obsession, she had to do something, so she methodically killed her children. Another example of OCD. But back to me. My obsession at that time was insomnia. I was obsessing about trying to sleep. I couldn't. I eventually went days without thinking. I mean, without sleeping. Because all I would do when I was trying to sleep was obsess about it. And the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't sleep. And I'm sure during that time I must have fallen asleep occasionally. But I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept. And then it became noticeable because, first of all, well, originally I was very anxious about it, being up all night with it every night. Then I became, as a result of that, sleepy, but not knowing it, wired but tired. I was depressed. What my family noticed was that I just completely withdrew from all my friends. It was summertime. I didn't want to go out and play. I just wanted to sit on the couch and usually just stare into space. My mother, as I recall, became frantic about this. She took me to 3 or 4 doctors, none of whom could find anything. The term depression wasn't mentioned a lot back then. And I remember one suggested maybe she give me vitamins. So she gave me many vitamins. And obviously she did some kind of talking with someone or reading about something, but she gave me many laxatives, even enemas. This was my whole life at that period. I didn't sleep, and I took a ton of vitamins and laxatives and enemas. It was horrible. Then at that same time, summer's almost over. It's time for school. My mother was a 4th grade teacher. She was the best teacher I've ever seen in action, and I've seen many at this point. She was the absolute best. Her students were engaged. They loved her. She loved them. They were learning. It was just a magnificent thing to see. But also, she found out just before school started that they wanted to move her, and we're still in this little town, Haynesville. They wanted to move her from 4th grade to 7th grade. Now that's middle school or junior high. There was actually 3 school buildings. Well, no, that's not true. But there were 3 white school buildings in Haynesville. There was the elementary, there was the middle school, the junior high, and there was the high school. Very old, very high school, old high school looking. And then there was the black school, Woodson, but that's another story. But when they moved my mother to 7th grade, almost all of her students were children of her friends. And she was put in a horrible predicament for her. She had not been used to ever having a discipline problem. And how could she discipline these kids of her friends? And yet they were acting like assholes, which frequently middle schoolers or junior high kids do. She was in a complete panic over this. She was obsessing about it. So yeah, my mom had OCD, no doubt. And what she did to alleviate that was begin looking everywhere for some kind of work as a school teacher other than here. And she found a place in Stamps, Arkansas. It was in another state. It was actually only 40 miles away from Haynesville, because Haynesville was 10 miles from the Arkansas line. But it might as well have been in Timbuktu, because we were moving to another state, me and my mother. I do not know why. I have a few ideas, but that was my salvation, at least from this first bout of OCD. I completely snapped out of my depression, completely. I was in Stamps for 4 years, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade. To this day, those were the happiest years of my life. What really saved me from what I've described as my first bout or nervous breakdown of OCD was that toward the end of that horribly depressing summer for me, when I was obsessing about insomnia, my mother, who was a fourth grade teacher, a master fourth grade teacher, was suddenly asked to move from her niche, her fourth grade, where she led an enchanting class, to seventh grade, which we call middle school, but back then it was junior high. My mother didn't want to move to that middle school. She did. She hated it for a number of reasons. Number one, she'd never dealt with that age child. She really didn't know how to interact with them the way she did her elementary kids. And many of them were, you know, as we can be in middle school or junior high, little assholes, and behaviorally. The second thing was, almost to a child, every one of her students were children of the kids she had grown up with in high school. And again, keeping in mind this is a very, very small little community. So she didn't even, well, she not only didn't know how to discipline, but she didn't want to discipline them. But they were so horribly behavioral. So my mom, who I think also had OCD, definitely had mental problems, began, you know, obsessing about that. And OCD can serve you. So what she did about that obsession, which she hated that so much, that being in that junior high class and having to teach those youngsters, she began to look everywhere for work as a teacher. And lo and behold, she found a job in Arkansas. We lived in Louisiana. It was a little town, very much as small, if not smaller than Haynesville. It was called Stamps, and it was only 40 miles from Haynesville. Haynesville was about 10 miles from the Arkansas line, but being that it was in another state, to us, especially to me, it was like another country. And I will just mention at this point that to get to Stamps from Haynesville, we had to pass through Hope, Arkansas, which I think I'd been to once before. And Hope is the hometown of Bill Clinton. And now they have his little house that he grew up in is now this national historical thing. But we moved to Stamps, Arkansas. Now, I don't know exactly why, but I think just because it was such a change of everything for me. It just got me completely out of my depression, my obsession with insomnia, and I was a happy kid again. I remember that we lived in a little house that we rented for $40 a month, and we lived next door to the superintendent of schools for that little county in Arkansas, and he had hired my mother. He liked her very much, which will be very important a little later. Like in Haynesville, I was big fish in a little pond. My mom was in the same building as my class was. She was teaching in the same building. But since it was a different state, a different school, it was like I was in a new world. Oh my goodness, I loved it. And since it was beginning of the school year, it was still hot, we didn't have air-conditioned schools then, we were allowed to wear shorts. And so I remember I put on some short shorts one day, and 10 or 11, my mother either didn't notice, she was so concerned about getting to school herself, but that's what I wore. And I got to class, and I was in the 4th grade. She taught 5th grade, but she loved that just as well because it was elementary. And my 4th grade teacher, looking back, was an educator, if you could even call her that didn't really quite know what she was doing yet. Now, I don't know what I did to upset her, Probably I was just being my sassy little self, really feeling myself. And I did something to cause me to get licks. Yes, they were big on capital punishment back then. Not capital punishment, corporal punishment. Maybe not just in the South, but definitely in the South. So I got 5 really hard licks on my butt. And although it hurt, I just felt like hot shit after that. I mean, I just felt, okay, cool. And because I was a straight A student, what was she doing giving me licks for? After school, my mother became so upset, not with me, but with that teacher, Miss Knight. Mom never quite got over that. So, another thing about stamps that I think is important is that I fell in love in stamps. I know I was only 10 or 11, but I fell in love with this wimpy little white blonde kid, and white because the schools were not integrated. And his name was Johnny. Now Johnny was a serial, I hate to call him a serial monogamist because he didn't do anything, but he would go with girls serially, one at a time. And I noticed this, and I noticed that all the girls liked him, and I just knew that, you know, I'll just hang out and do my little thing, and when he comes to me, there won't be any more girls. So one day, I can't say I waited patiently, I don't know what I did, but he sent one of his friends, his messenger, up to me to ask me, Johnny wants to know if you'll go with him. And I was with my girlfriends, and I said, yeah, I will. Now, Johnny and I didn't go anywhere. We didn't even acknowledge each other really, but all my friends knew and all his friends knew that we were going together. He was my boyfriend, I was his girlfriend. I guess you could say the culmination of that, when I was in 7th grade now, and we're going together all this time, although we didn't really go anywhere. But in 7th grade, we had this hayride. Now, I don't think hayrides are necessarily just southern, but they're definitely rural, which this area was. So one fall night, when it was just beginning to get a little cool, we met at my friend's house, who did live in the country, although the whole place was rural. She actually lived in the country part of Stamps. And we met at her house, and there was this big flatbed truck, and they would put bales of hay on it. And then they had blankets on it too. And then they would help each couple up into the truck, because couples for some reason. So Johnny and I got up into the truck. We sat down and leaned against 2 bales of hay. We put the blankets over us. He put his arm around me. And you know, I looked up at that starry sky and that moonlit night. I don't ever remember moonlit nights like I saw in Stamps, Arkansas. And he kissed me. Now, it certainly wasn't a French kiss because neither one of us knew what that was, but he kissed me. And I have to say that the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th grade of my life are still to this date the happiest time of my life. Boy, that's kind of hard to take in, kind of sad. But after I left Stamps, I remember I would go back and see a friend, and I would always hope to see Johnny. And I don't know if I ever did, but I have something that I remember. Honestly, the first time in my life and the only time, I don't know if it was a dream or if it was a reality, but I went back to Stamps, and I was on this bus, and I was sitting by him, and I was holding hands again. And to this day, I don't know if it really happened, but I guess I wanted it so much that that was kind of immaterial. There's one other thing I want to mention about Stamps. There was a wonderful woman that is now deceased, definitely a celebrity, a famed writer, who hailed from Stamps. I didn't. I was from Louisiana. She was from Stamps. She was born at Stamps. And that was Maya Angelou. That was the end, or the beginning of the end of the Jim Crow period. And so many black people were injured emotionally, physically, some even killed, lynched. It was a pretty horrible time for them. Well, nothing was pretty about it. She somehow survived it. And I know that because of her writings, which she used as grist for the mill, such as I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. But Maya Angelou, although we had very different experiences there, because she was born there and because she experienced Stamps at that particular point in time, was definitely a soul to remember. So I'm just totally digging Stamps. And then at the end of my 7th grade, what happened to my mother is something that I'm familiar with. It's called a teacher reduction in force, because I still do some teaching. And the last 2 teachers that were hired, the youngest, or not the youngest, but the latest hires, were the ones that were relieved of duty. And my mother was one, and the woman, the 4th grade teacher that gave me the licks, was the other one. So there we were. Now, the superintendent of schools who had hired my mother, I don't know whether he was fired or whether he just chose to go somewhere else as some type of promotion, but he left the superintendent of schools in a little Arkansas county that had 2 school districts to go to to go to Little Rock Air Force Base to become principal of Little Rock Air Force Base Elementary. Now, looking back, I can actually see how that was a promotion. And he asked my mom to go with him, and she said, sure. I was not happy about it at all. I was going into 8th grade. I'd just gotten this permanent. My hair used to be, well, it was naturally brown, auburn, and I had a lot of freckles, and I had metal braces on my teeth. So I went into 8th grade into Jacksonville, which was a suburb of Little Rock where the Air Force Base was, and I didn't know anyone. And Jacksonville was a huge place compared to Stamps and Haynesville. It was like 30,000 people. And I just kind of bumbled around. One thing, I don't know that I've shared, that I studied piano for about 10 years. I got to where I could play all sorts of classical stuff. Now the only thing I can remember and can play is a hymn called What a Friend We Have in Jesus. But I began to want to do something, so I joined the band. And I became a clarinet player. I'd never played clarinet before, but I was pretty good with music, and so I became second chair, I remember. And also at that time, I became one of the band's majorettes. I guess that's another name for twirlers. I had taken twirling classes when I was in Haynesville because all the little girls had to learn to twirl. With the baton, I even twirled fire. And that put me in touch with my first real female friend in Stamps, a girl that was in my grade, and she was a very popular girl. And she just took me under her wing, and we became friends. I remember staying at her house often on weekends. She was married. Her father was this ogre who you never saw. I don't know whether he worked, I don't know what he did, but they seemed to live quite well. And her mother and my mother became friends, but I would usually stay at her house. I used to love to stay at her house for a number of reasons, but one was because her mom always cooked us this full-fledged dinner, and she would bring it into my friend's room, and we'd eat on TV trays. You have to know that I grew up eating hors d'oeuvres and salads because that's all my mom knew how to make. She was the party girl. That's what I grew up on, and maybe that's a good thing. But I remember seeing the movie Mermaids with Cher, and Winona Ryder was her daughter, who was kind of sort of me as I think of it now. And that's what Cher's character knew how to make, hors d'oeuvres. That's what they grew up on. So I love that part of being with my friend. Also, my friend was already sexually active. Now, we're not even in ninth grade yet, but I remember I was fascinated with that because I certainly wasn't. And it was with this one boy, and I remember every month we had to just worry about whether or not she was pregnant. But as I lived there a little bit longer, I remember one night, I think we finally got to ninth grade, and one night I was at the Dairy Queen, the local Dairy Queen. And I went up to the window, and I noticed there was a boy standing next to me, and he had a football jacket on. He was taller than me, and before I could order, and he was also dead drunk. And before I ordered, he said to me before I was even looking at him, "Hi, what's your name?" And I looked at him and I said, "Debbie." He said, "That's a nice name. I like it." From that point on, I started going with that boy, actually dating him. And that's the boy I married. So from that point on, I was with him and graduated from high school. He was already in college. He was flunking out of college. And this was the time when the Vietnam War was really kicking into full gear. So he got drafted because he flunked out of college. Now, I can remember a lot of people saying, "Oh my God, you grew up in the 60s, the hippie days." No. I lived behind the Iron Curtain, the South. So we didn't have the long hair, we didn't have the sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And when you were drafted, you didn't go to Canada, you went to Nam. And I remember that just before he left, I had been in about 5 weddings. All my friends who had graduated from high school were getting married. We tend to do that down south. And I think still, actually, to some degree. I wanted to get married. And I talked him into it. Now in Arkansas, you couldn't get married quickly. You had to wait a few months. But you could in Arkansas. So my poor mother didn't even know. We eloped with my best friend and her already husband to Poteau, Oklahoma. So we got married there. And then we came back, and shortly thereafter, he flew off to Vietnam. And shortly after he got there, I realized I was pregnant. And it was just a confluence of things that began to happen. For one, my mother, who was getting ready to retire, became ill with the flu. It went into a staph infection. She died of sepsis within 2 months. I am pregnant. My father, who had retired from the Air Force, was in bed with my grandfather, who was old and very ill, elderly, to watch him. And the next morning they found both of their bodies in my grandfather's home in his bedroom, dead. They died of carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty vent in my grandfather's old summer home. So here I am, only child, lost both parents, pregnant, really no family in Arkansas, just my husband's family. So I'm thinking, I don't even know why I decided to do this. But this was when I discovered the power of the pen. I guess I was smarter than I thought I was. Thanks for listening to 2 episodes of Authentically Debz. If you like the show, please check out my website and leave us a review.